A small black figure lay on the hard green material of the cot. It was hardly the bed you would choose for a dying child, but the girl, Beth, was dying. Her insides were bleeding from the Ebola virus. Near the dying child, covered with an impenetrable material, sat the figure of an alien. The alien's hands were covered with thick blue latex, and her eyes were covered with gray glasses. Inside this personal protective equipment, Dr. Simone O'Reilly ran out of tears. Here, in this room, covered with antiseptic white sheets, like a visitor from another world, she sat with Beth, waiting for her to die. Dante wrote about the rings of hell, but he missed this circle, inhabited by unforgiving devils, disease, malnutrition, and bleeding flesh. Simone and her colleagues passed through this hell like visitors from another world, separated by a thin plastic sheet from a painful death, but suffering from a common humanity. "I also have a little girl named Beth," Simone said to the motionless figure. While Simone spoke, Beth, who was nearby, walked the border between pain and death. They could only touch through latex. The PPE suit was uncomfortable. It was a hot little torture chamber, which, according to everyone, was much better than the old suit. Simone knew her sins and accepted the suffering she deserved, but she could not accept the death and suffering that surrounded her daily journeys into this antiseptic abyss. Her friend Claire Hudson seemed less concerned. She was more accepting of the suffering that surrounded them. Claire is a nurse and Simone is a doctor. The doctor should have stopped it, but it continued. This devil had his own schedule, a harsh schedule of suffering and death. The best they could hope for was to hold it back like wildfire and pray that it would burn itself out. Clara has come to terms with this, but Simone has not. The doctor suffered with her patients and died a little with each of them. Beth moved from this life to the next, and Simone moved to the next room, and then the next. Early one morning in the dark, but she shared with Ben, Simone awoke from her latest nightmare. She was boating with her family when she ended up in the water. She and her daughters went swimming from the stern of the boat, and her daughters climbed back on board. But before she could get on, the boat began to move. Her husband, Jimmy, was ahead at the helm, and as the boat started moving, she shouted to him that she was still in the water. The girls screamed and called at her. She swam towards the boat, but it only moved away. Simone called to her husband, but he did not seem to hear. The boat floated further and further, and when it disappeared, she woke up. The hut was bathed in the gloomy light of early morning. Ben lay next to her, naked as she was. His hard body pressed against her soft one. His dark hand lay on her pale body. They had made love the night before, as they did almost every night. The needy, desperate sex of two souls seeking comfort and craving the touch of another person. Ben Robinson had a fiancée in Atlanta. He was a registered nurse with a PhD in public health. He came to do his part to contain this threat to human existence. Simone took the inexperienced young African-American man under her wing and guided him through the shock of their strange existence. In return, he gave her his tall, young black body and amazing sexual prowess. For such a young man, his skills in the bedroom were quite advanced. They supported each other and consoled each other when the inevitable crises occurred. Simone had them more often. Last night she fell ill after the death of little Beth. Somehow she couldn't completely separate the girl here from the one she'd left at home, but Ben was next to her. That's what they did for each other. Ben sent long emails to his fiancée at home, and whenever the satellite connection worked, he got in touch via Skype. His girlfriend wrote to him in response, and even wrote to Simone. In the last letter, she reminded Simone about Ben's upcoming birthday and asked Simone to make it special. Ben's girlfriend was named Amani, born in Goa, India, and then adopted by an American couple. Amani and Ben had an understanding. He left to fight his illness, and she stayed at home to build their future. They didn't feel the same guilt about their sex life that Simone and Jimmy had. They were two young people who did not see their future together as entirely exclusive. The thought of Jimmy was a demon haunting her in this hell on earth. Simone loved her husband. She needed to know that he was at home and waiting for her. But is he home? Jimmy didn't call or write. He sent letters from their daughters, and she heard from her sister-in-law that everything was fine at home. Her friend Clary learned from her husband that Jimmy had been seen with a young woman, some kind of lawyer. It might have been nothing, but Simona knew in her heart that it was not. Jimmy is a complex person. Outwardly, he did not show his emotions. As a man, he never cried, and anger was felt but never shown. He was very much like the man at the front of the boat who moved forward and never looked back. Ben stirred next to her. The day came with its share of old and new suffering. As dawn broke, Simone knew her family was still fast asleep in New York. She was wrong. Jimmy O'Reilly was still awake. He had had a long day, getting longer as he returned from his trip to New York. He traveled on the Samuel Gill case. New Jersey's appeal was filed in federal district court in Manhattan. The traffic light obviously turned red and stopped flashing. That meant it could stop, didn't it? Attorney Jimmy O'Reilly represented what was known as the defendant's position on appeal. The matter arose in an unusual way. 15 years ago, Mary Slattery was strangled to death in her apartment in Trenton, New Jersey. At the time, Trenton police had multiple suspects in the murder of the 27-year-old schoolteacher. Mary loved one-night stands. There was no shortage of male suspects, and in this extensive list, Samuel Gill was only one of them. He had an alibi, provided by his drinking buddies, but perhaps not that strong. 15 years later, DNA that was originally found at the murder scene and found to be non-viable has been transformed into a new lead thanks to advances in forensic science. DNA from the carpet under Mary's body became usable, and the police began testing all their former suspects. Samuel Gill, when asked, agreed to give a swab of his cheek, but refused to travel from Saratoga, where he now lived, to Trenton to do so. Gill suggested visiting a local laboratory, but Trenton police insisted on taking the sample themselves. Gill refused to go to New Jersey, saying he couldn't afford to take time away from his job as a carpenter. "There is no trade union work here. If you don't show up, you'll be replaced," Gill told the detective. Trenton police told Gill they would contact him. That's what they did, trying to surprise Gill at his home in Clifton Park on a Friday evening after work. With the house under surveillance, 2 Trenton detectives waited throughout Friday for Gill's return. They contacted the New York State Police on Saturday morning. When they contacted Gill's employer early Saturday morning, a sleepy construction foreman said Gill had moved out of state. The foreman was not asked why, nor did he say that the company's main current work was building houses in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. State police believed Gill was on the run and ordered his arrest. Of course, there was no warrant from the judge, no other legal procedures, or any further verification. Such formalities were the preserve of ordinary citizens, not the illustrious New Jersey State Police. On Sunday evening, while returning home from a weekend with his girlfriend in Massachusetts, Gill was stopped and arrested by state police. The charge was unclear, but the handcuffs were tight. Lawyer O'Reilly received a call around 8 p.m. on Sunday and went to meet with a client he had previously only represented in a speeding case. O'Reilly still had an outstanding bill awaiting payment, but what can you do? The man is in a cell. The presence of a lawyer and the absence of a warrant or any lasting charges cleared Sam Gill that Sunday night. Under the circumstances, Sam decided that Trenton could, as he put it, shove his DNA test where there is no sun. One subpoena and a federal district judge's decision to dismiss the subpoena led to O'Reilly dodging questions in district court. New Jersey wanted a cheek swab, and strangely enough, Sam Gill opened his wallet wide to confront them. A 3-judge panel was debating the limits of unreasonable search under the Fourth Amendment, and Jimmy O'Reilly was poised to challenge the Fifth Amendment. Regardless, he answered questions from the very hot bench, where judges press lawyers with hypothetical scenarios and questions. New Jersey spoke first, and several questions were asked. 8 minutes were given, and the time was marked using a traffic light. First green, then amber in the last 90 seconds. When the red light flashes, you stop. But judges are not bound by traffic lights. They can keep asking questions until they get bored. The chief judge was a woman who apparently had a love affair with the Fourth Amendment. Jimmy answered her questions and insisted on his own. In the end, Mr. Gill pays and the clock continues to tick, no matter what the colors say. "Okay, then, to sum up your position, Mr. O'Reilly," the female judge finally said, "is the state of New Jersey's request unreasonable under the circumstances?" "Yes, Your Honor. If the court pleases, my name is Eric Schwartz, and I represent the Attorney General of New York, who filed the expert opinion," said a very young Assistant Attorney General of New York. New York State came to the aid of its sister state, but Eric was even less fortunate than his colleague from New Jersey. His particular problem was Judge Blaine, a district court judge from Western New York who was sitting to fill out the three-judge panel. "Mr. Schwartz, is New York's position that it is reasonable to require a person's DNA 15 years after the crime was committed?" Judge Blaine asked. Well, the prosecutor doesn't consider it burdensome, just a swab from the cheek. Yes, and in an attempt to obtain DNA, this man was just arrested and held without charge, Blaine replied. As stated, it was a hot bench, and everyone went through the protocol. Fortunately, although there was significant doubt on O'Reilly's side, everything was on track for a ruling in his favor. 2 hours later, Jimmy was sitting with 2 cans of Molson's in what Amtrak calls its cafe, heading north. To begin with, he bought 2 cans of beer so as not to have to go through the line a second time for the next portion. The drive to Rensselaer, Albany took 2 hours and 40 minutes, enough time to drink 2 beers and take stock of the day. Allowing time and expenses, his total was just over $2,200, not counting tips for the taxi driver in New York and parking fees at the Rensselaer train station. Not a bad take for this day. Eric Schwartz sank into the seat opposite him and acted as if they were friends by virtue of their appearance in federal court together. "Told them we wouldn't achieve anything," he said. Jimmy grunted in response, checking his numbers. "I don't see the point. They'll take DNA anyway," Eric grumbled. He suddenly caught Jimmy's attention, although the defense lawyer's face still showed no interest. Jimmy said, taking a sip of his beer. "Do you think the train will arrive on time, or should I add another half hour of travel time? Usually, moving north, he is about 20 minutes late." Eric paused and thought for a moment. "I wonder why that is." "The client can resist. He's already upset that he was arrested," Jimmy said, thinking for a moment. "Yes, it's a colossal waste of time when you have to collect garbage, collect DNA from a drinking vessel, a door handle, whatever." O'Reilly's new good friend Eric, an assistant prosecutor, simply said what the police would do when the court turned them down. "She will have additional work, but will not have to stop working." O'Reilly wondered how his client would take the news. "That's a pretty big score. And by the way, they'll still have the DNA." Clearly, Jimmy had to do something. But what? Simone was called to a meeting with Alice Johnson, the chief administrator. There was nothing unusual in this, but still, it is strange that she was not told about the purpose of the meeting. "Please have a seat," Alice said. After sitting down, Simone looked at Alice, a woman of about 50. Alice sat at her desk as if they were in a state hospital rather than in a hut at the foot of a West African hill. "I called you to personally tell you the news that I'm sending you home to rest." "But why?" "My job is here," Simone demanded. "But your head is not." "Dr. O'Reilly, whom I met 2 years ago, was a strong and completely dedicated professional," Alice began. "But Simone O'Reilly, whom I sit opposite, is a troubled woman. Your friend Claire told me about the personal problems you carry around in your head. I understand your situation. Your problems are common, but without them, it is difficult to work here. Working here and carrying the burden of guilt will break even the strongest. You need to go home and sort out your family affairs. I won't let people burn out or break down while I'm on duty. But you need me. The kids need me, and this fight is critical. If we lose the battle here, there is no telling how many people will die. That's why I'm sending you home. This is a fight to the death, and it will not be won this month, this year, or perhaps in my lifetime. The world doesn't see it yet, but if we fail, the consequences will be unimaginable. I need my people 100%. Go home. Solve the problem and then come back. I want Simone O'Reilly, but I want her to be the best she can be." With those words, Alice pulled Simone away, and both women knew it was the right decision. Simone needed to come to terms with herself. She needs to solve the problems she was running from. The first case of Ebola in the United States was diagnosed in Dallas, Texas. The disease spread to one health worker and then to another. Within weeks, isolated cases began to emerge among travelers and healthcare workers returning from abroad. Many panicked, and politicians reacted, some with courage, others with fear. Dr. Simone O'Reilly, a distinguished pediatric surgeon, was quarantined after landing at Newark International Airport. She had to turn to the person she least wanted to ask for anything. Jimmy O'Reilly's first call came just after 9 p.m., as he was putting his daughters to bed. The call came from a representative of Doctors Without Borders, who informed him that his wife had been detained upon returning from West Africa. Jimmy knew his wife was returning, but did not know the exact date and time. The relationship between husband and wife had reached a point where communication was difficult. By the time of the second call from Simone, he was already on the move. After the first call, he didn't hesitate to pick up the phone and call Carrie Wilson, but it still seemed unusual to him to call his mistress about his wife's problems. He dated Carrie for almost 4 months. She wasted no time in telling him that she expected sexual relations, and if he did not want to, he should say so in advance. Carrie had a lot in common with Simone. They were both dedicated professional women. Each knew what she wanted and didn't let the mundane everyday life that the rest of the world lived get in her way. Carrie had a fiancé, Raymond Emerson, who was the Assembly Majority Counsel. Ray met Carrie during her first month of work in Albany. The wedding date has not been set. Each of them believed that this was a question of the status of each of the parties. They were a power couple from Albany, who wanted to be a power couple from Washington. Carrie described her relationship with Raymond as open. Jimmy didn't know what that meant. Were they both having sex with other people? Or was it Carrie alone? Jimmy was told that she spent time with him purely for relaxation, but he also noted that their relationship was not only sexual. She seemed to enjoy his company. He thought that perhaps he was an outlet for her relationship from pure politics. But he didn't know for sure because she had never discussed Raymond Emerson with him. Jimmy knew that Carrie could contact the governor. Out of necessity, he would ask the woman he slept with to help him let his returning wife go. Like a good lawyer, he blocked out his feelings of hypocrisy and humiliation and called. Carrie readily agreed to help. It offended her ultra-liberal beliefs that returning medical workers were being held against their will, and Jimmy knew she took great satisfaction in being able to help the woman whose husband she had seduced. But most of all, Carrie liked that Jimmy had to ask for a favor. She enjoyed the fact that she could do what her lover could not do. She loved showing him that she had such power over her partner. Jimmy didn't envy Raymond Emerson. This ambitious young man became involved with the Panther, both in and out of bed. Simone's call that evening was short and, as Jimmy knew, humiliating for her, as she begged him to do something. He didn't remember her ever being so upset, even when she was literally being dragged away to be raped. That's how they met, when he saved her from 3 drunken frat boys over a decade ago. Now she begged him to bring her home. She was very shocked. Carrie called back 20 minutes after he spoke with Simone. She was in the mode of an assistant to the governor. Only instructions, a professional political assistant, issuing a list of to-dos to a subordinate. The firm is Simcoe, Bryce, and Taylor. The lawyer is Ted Bryce. He will be waiting at the federal courthouse in Newark at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. The governor will call the judge tonight and ask him to hear this first thing. You will go to Newark this evening and receive a signed affidavit. I'll fax them to your office now. One from Simone and one from the epidemiologist, who will meet you in the U.S. Air First Class Lounge, Carrie said. Then she added, "Whatever you do, don't lose your Irish temperament." "Thank you, Carrie. You owe it to the governor, Jimmy. He won't forget, and neither will I." He left his daughters with his sister and her wife while he drove south on the thruway to Harriman and on Highway 17 to I-287 in New Jersey, then on I-95 to I-78. The airport parking lots were full. The terminal was busy and overloaded with security. To call it overloaded and poorly managed would be putting it mildly. He had difficulty getting into the U.S. Air first-class lounge because he did not have a ticket. The officer in charge, when he finally got through, realized that he was an attorney who was scheduled to meet with the U.S. Air passenger. After checking the computer, they discovered that Dr. Carl Jennings from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had flown in from Atlanta, but his flight was delayed. Having agreed that he would be called on his mobile when the doctor arrived, Jimmy went in search of the place where his wife was being held. It took persistence and some legal threats to get him taken to the area now designated as a quarantine site, which turned out to be little more than an office with an interior window through which one could talk. No one seemed to know what to do or where to move next. Jimmy told Simone through the glass that he would take her out the next morning. Then some high-ranking asshole from airport security tried to kick him off the airport grounds. However, a group of lawyers from the American Civil Liberties Union showed up, and during the ensuing verbal argument, Jimmy left to find out the current whereabouts of his epidemiologist. As he headed back to the first-class lounge, staff called to say that Dr. Jennings had arrived and was waiting for him. It was already 2 o'clock in the morning and the airport was starting to slow down. In the waiting room, Dr. Jennings greeted Jimmy and invited him to sit while he read the affidavit. "Yes, that's what Miss Wilson and I discussed," Jennings said. "A very competent woman. She chose this place because of the notary who works for them. Very meticulous and knowledgeable young lady. Carrie really thought about everything, but tell me how she brought you here." "Oh, I was already on my way because of this whole quarantine fiasco." "It's really useless. I went to see if I could talk to people in power. I'm glad I can help your wife. Without people like her, we would actually be worried about the spread of Ebola. But if, and I mean if, they can contain this disease in West Africa, the world will owe them a huge debt." The next morning, everything went like clockwork. A federal judge released Simone by 9 a.m. and then signed an order showing cause why the remaining detainees should not be released. Even as they stood before a judge and New Jersey lawyer Ted Bryce argued the case, the governor of New York issued a statement condemning the detention of returning healthcare workers without cause. By noon, Jimmy took Simone onto the New York Expressway and headed home. Since she got into their rather old but reliable Honda, she hasn't said a word. All Jimmy could get from his wife was monosyllabic grunts and shakes of his head. On the way out of Kingston, he got fed up. He pulled over, drove through the traffic circle, and stopped for lunch at a nearby diner. Having parked the car and turned off the engine, he said, "It's just over an hour away from home and you're not able to meet your daughters. What the hell is going on with you?" He had known his wife for more than 10 years, but what happened next surprised him. The strong woman he thought he knew was completely broken. She cried, yes, but it was more than that. He felt such pain in her that he had never experienced before. He hugged her and calmed her, as one would calm a hysterical child. "It's okay, you're safe now," he said, running his hand along the back of her head and her face buried in his shoulder. "Now nothing can hurt you." "I won't allow this. How could they do this? Put me in a cage like an animal. You're free now, everyone is just afraid. Not everyone can be brave when faced with a threat they simply don't understand." She began to cry, and her body shook for the better part of an hour. He ended up going to the diner alone for takeout. They ate in the car while he tried his best to comfort her. She was hungry, exhausted, and spiritually broken. Despite everything that stood between them, he realized that he loved his wife, and always would. Whether their marriage will work again is another matter. He put it aside for now. Simone spent a week recovering. She spent time with her daughters, Vicky and Beth. They missed her, but it was clear that they didn't need her. The girls were delighted with the expected birth of their cousin. Lisa, their Aunt Tara's wife, was 8 months pregnant, and the baby could be born in as little as 2 weeks. No one told the girls that the male donor was their father and that the new child would be their sibling. Lisa says they're going to name him James, Beth told her mom. But Dad doesn't want them to do that, Vicky intervened. He doesn't like the name James. Did you know about this? Yes, we discussed it when we thought you might be a boy, Simone told Vicky. Beth thought the idea of Vicky being a boy was very funny. Then Tara appeared and kicked the girls out to play. Go, sunbathe while you can. It's already autumn, and winter will come soon. When the girls left, Simone said, I guess you did it because you want to talk. Yes, she said. Lisa thinks Jimmy might want to hear the reason about you and him. He's matured a little since you last left. I think you mean Carrie Wilson, but I don't think he took a mistress to get an insight. Don't belittle the lady. My brother has a weakness for independent women. And like you, she has a liking for a smart man who can accept a smart woman as a partner. But she doesn't pretend to play the game with one person, and he accepts it. He had lost some of his silly romantic notions. Is this how you see our marriage? That's how I see him now. You have a job to do in this world, and so does he. It is foolish to try to live up to unrealistic standards in your circumstances. If you love someone, set them free. If he comes back, he's yours. If not, then it shouldn't have happened. Haven't you become an understanding soul? Of course I found the love of a good woman. I have the luxury of having my loved one to the fullest. You and Jimmy will never have more than breaks between jobs. He will have to come to terms with this. At this moment, Jimmy was waiting for Carrie Wilson at the Latham Inn. The hotel was one of those places where people went to avoid being noticed. Carrie did not hide her relationship, but did not flaunt it either. People are willing to accept a lot as long as it's not shoved in their face, Carrie said. Jimmy had that tough shell that defense lawyers cultivate. He didn't care what people thought. Only his own opinion mattered. He didn't shove his affair in Simone's face, but he didn't hide it either. He knew what his wife did when she was not at home, and he enjoyed the same privilege for himself. Now that she had returned, he did not know what to do with either his wife Simone or his mistress Carrie. Carrie called and asked to meet her at a quiet hotel. When she appeared, she was all smiles. You look happy, he said. Because of you, my love, she said, kissing him. Didn't you hear? You won New Jersey vs. Gill. Now it was Jimmy's turn to smile. He was almost sure of the result, but it was nice to know that he had won for sure. When he grinned, Carrie laughed. The hotel didn't have table service at that time of day, so Jimmy went to the bar to get a Cosmo for Carrie. When he returned to the table, a tall and stunningly beautiful brunette entered on the arm of a large Mediterranean guy. Both members of the couple nodded at Carrie and then continued to ignore them. Seeing Jimmy's confusion, Carrie whispered, Susan Singleton and Tony Greco, they have something going on. He is the governor's top political advisor, and she is vying to be the communications director for his next campaign. Jimmy looked at Susan carefully. He had never seen the woman who was married to Stephen Fitzgerald, a.k.a. Foxy. She was everything everyone said about her, including, apparently, a woman who played with someone. I heard she's married, Carrie said. Yes, I know her husband. He's now defending Roger Hamilton, the Hamilton who killed his pregnant wife. The same one, but still supposedly who killed his pregnant wife. As far as I've heard, the trial is a mere formality, Carrie opined. You never know, especially with Foxy, Jimmy replied. In truth, he respected the man they called Foxy. Like Jimmy, he was not afraid to play cards from the bottom of the deck if it was necessary to win. This reminded Jimmy that something needed to be done to prevent the police from subjugating the decision he had just won. There must be a way to distract them from taking Jimmy's client's DNA. Hey, are you still with me? Carrie asked. Sorry, I just had a random thought. Well, I hope there's a bed and me in it, she said. Jimmy laughed. Well, I suggest your apartment, since my wife lives in mine now. Thanks to me. So I guess she'll just have to let me borrow her husband for myself. But not before he treats me to dinner. That evening, Jimmy put his difficulties aside for later. The answers to his problem, what to do with Gil's DNA and what to do with his wife, will come to him on their own. Carrie was looking for a bed partner, and at the moment he owed her. They went to Carrie's apartment on State Street, 2 blocks above the Capitol building. It was not very well furnished. Carrie didn't see it as a permanent home. It was a place to stay while she waited for her boss to run for president. The exception was the bedroom, which Carrie had carefully furnished with a large, old-fashioned closet and a large sleigh bed in imitation of French Baroque. This bedroom was at the back of the house, overlooking the rear garden and carriage drive. The heavy shutters on the front windows muffled the street noise. The floor below was the office space of one of the many lobbying firms. Carrie wasted no time in pouring each of them a glass of wine and retreating to the bedroom. She undressed and lay naked, sipping wine, leaning back against the head of the bed. Jimmy put his wine on the nightstand and took off his clothes. He knelt between her legs, knowing what she wanted. Carrie was a woman who believed that a man's best element was his tongue. She liked it when he was slow and teasing. It was easy with her. He could take his time and enjoy her body. Carrie was a woman who stroked a man's ego, but do not forget that she considered it her right to sleep with any man she wanted. She had very few lovers, and she always checked them well. She could be promiscuous, but she didn't like being promiscuous with her lovers. Someone's husband is fine, but if he has another mistress, that's no longer acceptable. She believed in a kind of relative infidelity for myself. This was the difference between an emancipated woman and just any man's easily accessible girlfriend. "Will you go to her house tonight?" she asked, clinging to her exhausted lover. "I can't stay, if that's what you're asking. I have to be at the office early in the morning." "Are you going to have sex with your wife tonight?" "We haven't had sex since she left last time." "Why? You can't still be mad at her," Carrie said, propping herself up on one arm to look into his eyes. She was genuinely curious. Carrie understood how upset a proud man could be when he learned of his wife's infidelity, but the extent of Jimmy's anger, even after their own affair, was puzzling. Jimmy put his hand behind his head and tried to answer the question. Why didn't he make love to his wife? She is a beautiful woman to whom he is immensely attracted. He loves her deeply, no matter what. And yet, there was no physical intimacy between them at the moment. "Probably because I love her so much," he said. Carrie shook her head. "This is not love, but jealousy. If this was love, then you would want her to be happy, not both of you to be unhappy." "So that's what you and Raymond have, true love?" Carrie frowned. She never spoke to her lovers about Ray. "Ray and I have an understanding." "I'm careful, but he looks the other way." "I'm just too young to commit myself to an exclusive relationship at the moment," she answered as usual. Perhaps she even began to believe this lie, because she told it so often. "But you want the prestige of the relationship. To be an assistant to the governor and a power broker in the assembly," he finished for her. It said cynically, but yes. "And any further discussion of Ray is prohibited," she said, again hiding the truth. "I understand, but my situation is different. I didn't live in a fairy tale. There were children to feed and bills to pay. However, I have lived a romance where love conquers all." Carrie smiled wryly and shook her head. "You really are a mystery. A tough lawyer who doesn't take any crap and dreams of being the hero of some Hollywood romantic comedy. Are you laughing at me now?" "No, it's your mistress who pities you," she said. And she gave him a long, lingering kiss that came from the heart. She could love this man. And yet he threatened the tough professional woman she aspired to be and the great career she had envisioned for herself. Simone got up early. Jimmy returned home late that evening, and although he had just showered, she could still smell the other woman's perfume on him. She didn't say anything. Her plan was to keep her mouth shut and do whatever it took to get him back. She didn't know how this could be done. Today, she visited the hospital. She had been out of regular work for 8 months during her last MSF assignment. It's time to show up and give credit to the local team. She made an appointment with the hospital's chief administrator, Ellen Perry, and the chief of medical staff, Dr. Clark. They met in Ellen's office, located in a separate building across the street from the hospital itself. Ellen and Jake Clark were very cordial. She was about 60 years old, but contrary to everything, the director of personnel, Dr. Clark, was only about 30. They sat Simone down and began what seemed like a friendly conversation over a cup of coffee. But after discussing the difficulties and problems associated with Simone's work in Africa, they got to the point where Simone expected them to ask when she would return to work. Then there was silence. "Well, I intended to stay home until the end of this week. But I can go out on Monday if that's soon enough for you," Simone said. The silence continued as the receptionist exchanged glances with his HR director. Finally, Ellen spoke. "As hard as it is to say, the circumstances are unusual." Ellen stared at her empty coffee cup. Dr. Clark intervened. "It's impossible to say simply, but we believe that in the current climate, your return would be devastating." For a moment, Simone didn't understand, and then she understood too well. "You can't believe I have Ebola." No, Clark assured her, "but the public is panicking. Under the circumstances, your worker—" Clark's voice broke, so Ellen Perry explained it. "We simply cannot take you back until the fear subsides. Then, of course, we will be very happy to reinstate you," Ellen said. "Restore?" asked Simone. "Yes, we revoked your authority. You are not allowed to practice here at this time," Ellen said. "But only temporarily until things calm down," Clark added. Simone was stunned. She understood the fear of the ignorant. Ebola is a terrible disease. Even the actions of heartless politicians feeding on public fears are understandable. But these are informed medical personnel who know that the risk is negligible. Why would they ostracize her for making personal and professional sacrifices? You understand that if we don't contain this disease where it is now, then everyone will be in danger. Thousands of health workers are needed to combat this. Do you ostracize them all when they return? And if so, who would be willing to give up everything to fight this thing? Administrator Ellen's response was immediate. "It's none of our business. We need to run the hospital." Who would bring their children to an institution where there is even the slightest possibility that the doctor is sick with a contagious disease? Simone returned home to a woman whose convictions had been shaken. She returned to the house where she lived with the man she loved. To the house where her 2 daughters grew up, but no longer hers. Now she wondered what had become of her life. She was sure that she had done the right thing by going to Africa, but she had lost everything. The job she loved is no longer there. The husband she loved is sleeping with another woman. Do her daughters love her? Jimmy O'Reilly sat in police court with a headache. She showed up shortly after meeting with client Sam Gill. The client was pleased with the appeals court's verdict, but his joy turned to worry when the lawyer told him that Trenton police would undoubtedly now try to obtain his DNA through other means. "This can't be legal." The court said no. Gill doubted. "Yes, well, not really. You see, if they accidentally stumble upon your DNA in the open world, then the Fourth Amendment will not apply. Reading the decision we received from the Court of Appeal, that is exactly what they will do. The decision was written by Judge Shaw, the woman who chaired the 3-judge panel. According to her interpretation of the Fourth Amendment, its application requires a quantity of new evidence sufficient to satisfy an independent investigator of the necessity of a further search. The old DNA was not suitable for this, even though there was a new test. In other words, without new evidence linking Samuel Gill to the crime, the new test does not apply. But the police were going to do everything they could to find this new connection. "What can we do? I paid a lot of money. And what are you going to do?" Gill's attitude seemed to escalate into an accusation that the lawyer had deceived him. Jimmy sympathized but couldn't understand what was his fault or even what was ultimately bothering Gill. However, given his fee, Gill may have felt a little resentful. "It occurred to me that, when you were detained, the state police didn't take a picture of you. At best, they only have a general description of you. The Trenton police never saw you at all," Jimmy said. "So, well, I think in order to collect your DNA, they will need to follow you, and that can be confusing. For example, think about it. If someone with your general description lived at your house and drove your car, and you were in Massachusetts at work, Gil was confused, so Jimmy had to explain his idea in detail. But after the trick was laid out, Gil understood the wisdom of it. One of Tara O'Reilly's investigators, who is of general height and fits Gil's description, was to stay at Gil's house for several weeks. Sam Gil, on the other hand, was traveling out of state for work. Jimmy expected his client to protest about the inconvenience. In fact, Gil was not just delighted, but practically ecstatic. A little bell went off in Jimmy's head. Usually clients weren't so accommodating. They mumbled, resisted, and argued that they should not experience inconvenience. In the end, they are certainly right, and the lawyer's job is to get them exactly what they wanted. Gil, on the other hand, seemed to accept this deception as if it was what he had been looking for all along. 2 hours later, Jimmy was at the Albany Police Court, awaiting his turn in court. This client was found over the legal drinking limit leaning against the hood of his vehicle. It was parked in Nova Scotia, on a block that contained not one but 3 adult establishments. The police first questioned him and then tested him for sobriety. He was then charged with driving while intoxicated, although he was not driving at the time. The prosecution argued that he was driving, which he admitted. The defense insisted that he was not driving once he became intoxicated. Most judges would have thrown out the case at the preliminary hearing, but there was a big anti-drunk driving campaign in town, and the DA was showing how tough he was. So whether he was guilty or not, he had to go to trial. The trial itself never took place. At the end of the pressure, the prosecution found him guilty of disturbing public order. In the end, the accused stood on the street in a state of complete intoxication. His head was starting to hurt. Jimmy looked to the right. 4 empty seats away sat Stephen Fitzgerald. They nodded to each other. Stephen was nicknamed Foxy in law school. Jimmy remembered how funny they all called him. He got this nickname not because of any legal ability, but because he had the most beautiful girlfriend anyone had ever seen. She was described as a real beauty. When it was discovered that she was the daughter of a wealthy insurance tycoon, Stephen was renamed Foxy. And yet, how can you be a vixen while married to an unfaithful woman? There were those who were jealous of Jimmy and called him a shrewd bastard who was married to a pretty doctor. According to his colleagues, he was at his best. Will they think the same now? Here he sat, working off his fee for a fictitious case. 4 seats away, the lawyer defending the area's biggest murder case was also stuck, awaiting a magistrate's trial. Why? Because Foxy's company didn't think anything of him. Sharp Jimmy and Foxy. Stephen made the same mistakes. In life, it is not enough to be smart. You have to be lucky. Marrying the wrong woman? No, that is not true. If you love the wrong woman, you are in a dead end. Foxy worked in a good large firm, but he was not a partner and obviously had no intention of becoming one. Everyone knew about Foxy's work situation, just as they knew that his wife was running after him. Jimmy, too, was struggling to make ends meet while his wife flew off to Africa to play house with the medical stallions in a nobly attempt to save the world. Jimmy's situation was also known. They call it a city, but it's actually a small town, he thought. I wonder if we're in the wrong business, said Foxy. Jimmy's thoughts wandered so far that he didn't notice Foxy crossing the distance between them. Actually, not only this, but also other things, Jimmy answered. Yes, life is a funny thing, Foxy seemed to be thinking. Have you ever thought about what we really do? I don't quite understand what you mean. We protect people. Does this apply to the innocent or the guilty? I think both of them. Have you ever managed to get rid of the culprit? Foxy asked. I don't know. Probably yes. Do you think this is a risk we're taking? And yet, when you conduct a case, you risk convicting someone innocent. It seems like a big risk, Jimmy said. Maybe. I was thinking about my wife, Jimmy admitted. And you believe that we have a common problem? Foxy said, arching one eyebrow to look both skeptical and mocking. In a word, yes, Jimmy answered. Perhaps, but your wife can be a problem that only exists if you let her. Living with a conscience is much more difficult than living with a woman. I think it all depends on a man's opinion of himself. This conversation was a set of riddles, questions without definite answers. They then called the case Jimmy, ending the strange discussion. In the days that follow, Jimmy will wonder if Stephen knows something about Jimmy's problems, or if Foxy Stephen is just trying to solve his own. Both men were married to strong-willed women with independent and successful careers. Both wives supported them, and they seemed to love their husbands. Both men were aspiring lawyers with dim career prospects. However, Foxy hinted at another connection. Did they both represent murderers? By the time Jimmy left court, it was late evening. Having been out the entire previous evening, he decided to return home early and enjoy his daughters. "You have to see your mom," his daughter Vicky announced as he walked through the door. Her little sister Beth stood next to her, nodding seriously. "For what?" he asked, afraid of the answer. After their mother returned, the girls rode home by school bus. They enjoyed riding the bus with their friends. They liked that they didn't have to wait for Dad to pick them up from kindergarten. They liked that Mom was home and greeted them at the door. It was a real holiday, but not today. When they arrived home, they found their mother in the dark bedroom, crying. She kept telling them that she was fine and that she would be down in a minute, but in their young world, there was no concept of adults in trouble. Vicky, without knowing why, realized that there was some kind of problem between her parents. She believed that the problem was caused by her father. He was a large man, and although he was a loving father, the eldest daughter was under the impression that adults avoided her father. The exception was her mother, as well as her aunts. But now, her mother and father seemed to have lost the affection they had once readily shown. "Dad, you have to help Mom. She's upstairs on her bed crying," Vicky said. Jimmy ran up the steps, wondering what had his wife so excited. Due to the tightly drawn curtains and lack of light, the room was unnaturally dark. He turned on the bedside lamp and sat on the corner of the bed. Simone lay quietly, curled up, crying into her pillow. He put his hand on her shoulder and stroked it gently. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked. There was no response, other than a slight increase in the decibel level of her sobs. "You're scaring the girls," he said. "Is this something I did?" he asked. She slowly turned to look at him. "They don't want to take me back. I've lost everything. My job, my husband, my home. Everything was gone, and I do not know why." It took Jimmy a few moments to get the full story from his wife about the meeting at the hospital. Finally, he said, "Well, we can sue, I think." "This is your answer?" She waved it off. "Not really, but that's what I do. I just want to know why. No one doubts that we must fight this disease to prevent it from spreading. How can they do this to us? Not all good people receive rewards. In fact, I know damn few of them. It's a tough world. Now your daughters need to see you downstairs. If not smiling, then at least no longer crying." "What about my husband?" Jimmy understood the question. How can they continue to live? He thought about this a lot. Legally, he filed for separation after she left 8 months ago. But this was just a legal formality, a precaution that his legal education told him. He had no answer to the real question. "I'm here, and that's enough for now." "What about her? Do you love her?" she asked, sitting up and wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Jimmy laughed. He understood who she was, and the idea was a joke, if not funny. At his wife's gaze, he replied, "This lady has a fiancé. She's not in love with me, and I'm not stupid enough to fall in love with her." He slapped Simone on the thigh and said, "Now wash your face and go down the stairs. I'll order pizza. That should help with the girls." The folder lay unopened on his desk. He asked his sister Tara to gather all the information she could about the death of Mary Slattery in Trenton, New Jersey, about 15 years ago. Tara assigned this to one of her part-time computer nerds. Tara was currently busy with the birth of her son, James Henry O'Reilly. Lisa gave birth 2 weeks prematurely to a boy weighing 3 kilograms, 630 grams. Jimmy's daughters were happier than anyone else at the birth of what they were told was their new cousin. Few adults knew that the relationship was that of a brother and sister, as Jimmy O'Reilly was the fertilization donor for the unconventional couple. Jimmy was trying to come to terms with the fact that he was the father of a third child. He reflected that only a fool would ask a question whose answer might be contained in a folder on his desk. The guilt or innocence of Samuel Gill was none of his concern. This man had every right not to donate his DNA. As a serving attorney, Jimmy O'Reilly had a duty to protect his client's interests. He opened the case. Mary Slattery was the serial killer's third victim. 3 women were strangled in their own homes. The murders were committed about a month apart during the summer months. They were connected by a common murder weapon, an expensive stocking of a classic cut, tightly wrapped around the neck of each victim, an unusual murder weapon, and it tied these deaths together. Mary was the latest victim and possibly the victim of a copycat. Or not. The question is open and troubling. There was nothing linking Samuel Gill to any of the murders except that of Mary Slattery. Gill was identified as a man who had been with Slattery 2 days before the murder at a local bar. The couple left together, presumably to have sex. But on the night of the murder, Gill claimed he was with friends in Newark. There was nothing linking Gill to the murder. Blood was found on a fragment of the necklace. Mary was strangled, but there were no other injuries. It was likely that the blood belonged to the killer from a cut received when the victim was strangled. The latest police theory is that the killer cut his hand on a cheap metal necklace Mary was wearing that evening. Only a fragment of a broken necklace and some blood were found, and the rest of the necklace disappeared. A weak case even with a DNA match. But the police have no matches, yet. Over the years, Trenton police claimed there were other murders related to this, but in subsequent victims, the connection, unusual vintage stockings, was missing. The stockings were high class, expensive, with nylon seams, although made in the traditional way. Other murders involved less unique stockings. These murders occurred in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Jimmy told himself that for this reason, there was no reason to suspect Samuel Gill. But I couldn't get rid of the element of doubt. Tara had a man spying on Sam Gill's house and posing as Gill. If pressed, they will say that they are looking after the house of the absent Gill. About 2 weeks after the appeal court's decision, an unmarked sedan appeared. My boyfriend says that he is not there all the time. They come in the mornings, but they always show up in the evening before garbage collection, Tara told Jimmy. Do you think they found anything? It's unlikely that when my boyfriend is not there, the lights turn on a timer. Every Wednesday night, he takes out enough trash to keep everything looking right, but not to the curb, to the garage. They didn't stop there. A man generally matching Gill's physical description left Gill's home Saturday morning. He drove Gill's car to the mall, where he stopped at a dry cleaner, visited a hardware store, and ended up at Burger King. He was messy enough to abuse his desk, leaving a drink, food wrappers, and a half-eaten burger on it. I don't know what to do, said Simone. When I'm here, I feel guilty that I'm not there, and when I'm there, I feel guilty that I'm not here. Dr. Ellen Blake spent much of this, her first therapy session with her new patient, seeking medical history. The patient was referred by Dr. Swanson, who had previously been part of a marriage counseling couple. The problem then had been infidelity, but now Ellen suspected that the problem was much broader. In the notes she kept during marital counseling, her husband was extremely uncooperative, the kind of personality type that, in Ellen's experience, does not respond well to therapy. But the patient was a completely different matter. Simone O'Reilly was a woman desperate for help and ready to face her problems. Ellen's challenge was to find the root of these problems. Tell me, why do you feel guilty when you work abroad? Ellen asked. This was the easier of the 2 guilt questions, and Ellen expected, at such an early stage in counseling, to receive a banal answer. However, I was surprised by the answer. Simone expressed the usual feelings of guilt as a mother being separated from her family, but her anxiety about separation was related to her children. The feeling of guilt towards her husband transferred to her infidelity. Don't you miss your husband when you're not at home? Yes, I miss him very much, But I don't feel guilty. I'm doing the right thing, and I know he approves of my work. I feel guilty because I'm using other men to fill his absence, and I don't have anything Jimmy needs. Why do you say that? Doesn't he need a wife? Simone laughed a little sadly. Does Jimmy need someone? You don't know this man. At this point, they parted. The session ended, but it was productive, very productive. Simone immediately went home. She set up a satellite link to exchange texts with Claire Hudson in Liberia. The two women had been friends for many years. Simone missed her friend even more now that she had become something of a modern-day leper. When the connection appeared, neither woman bothered to waste time on pleasantries. Claire immediately moved on to asking her friend how the Hudson family was doing. Claire has 3 sons and a husband, whom she left. Simone assured her friend that, as far as she could tell, her husband and boys were doing well. I call and write every chance I get, but you can never say for sure. You know men, they hide everything until it's too late, Claire said. Declan Hudson was a big bear, a diesel mechanic. He was a man of few words, but with a kind heart. Simone knew Claire was worried for 2 reasons. Her sons managed without their mother, and Declan was a good man and was a hemisphere away from her. Relax, the boys are doing well and Declan isn't dating anyone. But how is Arthur? Claire laughed. Arthur is already in the past. He left for Nigeria. I hope you don't mind, but I'm busy with Ben. You left him without a partner, and it would be a pity to miss such a man. Well, I don't mind. He was my piece of meat. You don't use them, and besides keeping your bed warm, you have Jimmy. No, because he doesn't want to sleep in it. Still angry? I don't know, but he has this political bitch. I can't believe you're letting this go on. A man loves you, and we both know that when you want it, there is no man you can't have. So, turn on your sexuality and seduce a man. Has it really come to this, that I need to seduce my own husband? Yes, and quickly, before he replaces this bitch with someone more worthy. Look, my time is up, but text me when you can. Claire zoned out, but talking to her did more than a therapy session. Jimmy O'Reilly was the man. Even if all she can get from him is sex, it's time to get it. It's a stupid request, Rebecca said. She was a bright, if impatient, young woman. A graduate of Cornell Law School, she worked as a secretary at O'Reilly's firm the summer before last. After graduating from college, she took the bar exam and then returned home to be with her ailing father. It was the act of a loving daughter, but a damn stupid career move. Working as Jimmy O'Reilly's secretary was the only job she could get that she usually enjoyed, but not as a simple servant. Who's the boss here? Jimmy demanded. You, but why use a law graduate to find underwear? I have my reasons. Just find out who sells high-end vintage stockings, the kind with the hole. Short in the seam, she said. What? That's what it's called. A byproduct of the cross-linking process. Okay, find out if anyone nearby sells them. And then? Come back, and we'll put your fancy Cornell education to work. Jimmy knew his secretary was upset about the assignment, but he didn't dare use his sister or her team. It would have been crazy to even ask that question, but his conscience wasn't acting as wisely as usual. He was bothered by an empty conversation with Foxy Fitzgerald, a conversation complicated by the news that the apparently guilty Roger Hamilton had been found not guilty of murdering his pregnant wife. Foxy performed a miracle in the courtroom. The media's immediate reaction was one of shock. As details gradually leaked out about how Foxy manipulated the court and jury, shock turned to outrage. A rich man escaped punishment for murder. The courts are biased, and defense lawyers are to blame for everything. Perhaps in this case, the media and the public were right. Trenton police were looking for a serial killer, a man who strangled women with a stocking. A smart lawyer named James O'Reilly intervened in the case. It would be better to make sure that his actions are appropriate and not just legally acceptable. Simone was waiting for him at home. Their daughters were sent to her mother's for the evening. She wore a beautiful tea dress, attractive but modest. For dinner, I have beef stew with sour cream cookies, she said. It had been an old favorite since they first got married. Simone was taught this dish by her Hungarian neighbor, who lived in the same building where their first apartment was. The neighbor was an elderly woman who had recently lost her husband. The dish was a type of goulash, but very Americanized. The smell coming from the kitchen brought back memories. Jimmy could see an older woman and his young wife working at the stove in the small apartment. He smiled to himself. His wife was great. As soon as he heard that the girls had left, he expected some move from Simone. She had been hinting at some kind of reconciliation for several days, but was too shrewd to try outright seduction. She reminded him of earlier happy times. A table for two was set, candles were lit, and Aigri Bicavar bull's blood wine was opened. Jimmy picked up the bottle of wine as Simone came in from the kitchen with a steaming casserole. "What? Your red wasn't there?" he asked, referring to the cheap wine in liter bottles they bought at the discount store when they were newlyweds. Simone answered with a laugh. "You know he wasn't there. I found as close as I could." She paused and tilted her head in her characteristic thoughtful manner. "Perhaps I'm a little obvious?" "Only for me." They sat down, and while he poured the wine, she filled their plates. She brought her glass to his, and when they touched, she said, "For our love." "For our love," he repeated. The food was amazing, and as it should have been, it nourished not only his stomach but also his soul. Looking across the table, he admired his wife's beauty. He reminded himself that it wasn't just skin. She is a truly good person. She proved this with her work. Her trip to Africa was not a liberal self-delusion. She went because she was in demand. She was not by nature a physically brave woman and endured daily dangers while inwardly trembling with fear. Perhaps this is where true courage lies. Be scared, but stand firm and do your job. On the scale set by his wife, Jimmy knew that his own courage was sadly lacking. He was afraid of tomorrow, lack of money, or being caught in an immoral fraud. His fears were vague and constant, and yet he continued to move, looking neither to the right nor to the left, but always forward. He ran towards the fire, because if he had turned his back on it, he would undoubtedly have been burned. What the world thought was courage was terrible fear. "It won't work," he said. "It's impossible to go back to what it was." Simone smiled sadly and twirled the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. "I didn't think we could, but maybe we can remember better times as we look for a way forward." "What do you want from me?" "Understanding. I know I hurt you, but is there no way to forgive?" she asked, reaching across the table to touch his sleeve. "My problem is not a lack of understanding. I understand. You needed a man you could hold on to. And it was always needed. I can't be with you when you need me most. So you find someone who can. It hurts? Yes, very. But I forgave you almost the moment you first admitted what you did. Baby, I'm so sorry. I see the pain on your face, but I have to ask, where should we go next? Don't know. Your work is abroad. You could stay here, but then you'll never be happy. I can't leave with you. I have a job here and children to think about. They are my children too. Yes, but they understand what you are doing. What do you need to do? And when you're here with them, you're really here. These last weeks have been good for them. They have a stay-at-home mom, and they love it. But they are growing and will soon become independent people. You need to spend as much time as possible with them without forgetting about your own life. But what about my husband? I tried to return what was clearly gone. I wish counseling would help, but it's not what's right for me. Simone could only nod. Jimmy could never open up, never revealed the inner man, or rather the sad little boy who was hurt by his wife's betrayal. Simone walked around the table, hugged her husband tightly, and said, "I love you so much." The call, when it came, was not unexpected. Samuel Gill was in eastern Massachusetts, hundreds of miles from his lawyer's office and the police investigating him. He drifted in and out of the Albany area, avoiding police. He had only one question for his lawyer: "Can I relax now?" Well, of course they took samples, but the explanation was a little complicated. On TV, it seemed like all the police had to do was take the cup away. Real life created more difficulties. Each sample may contain multiple sets of DNA. Each sample may not be suitable for use. Police were looking for a DNA sample that could be linked to a man they believed to be Sam Gill. In all likelihood, they will not have a complete set of chromosomes, but some set that may match the sample from the murder scene. Obtain a quantity of new evidence sufficient to convince the independent investigator that he should investigate further. Gill didn't believe that the person they replaced him with in his home would be any good. Jimmy couldn't help but think of the conclusion that could be drawn from this. They are clearly still doing their tests. It might take them a while, Jimmy said. How will we know? I think when they stop searching your garbage, that will be a good indicator. There are many court decisions that hold that trash placed on the curb for collection is abandoned and is public property. The police can search him without a warrant. But Gill lived in the city of Bethlehem. There was no municipal garbage chute. A private garbage collector came to pick him up once a week. Until this time, the trash had been stored in Mr. Gill's garage to keep the neighbors' raccoons away. Thus, it was still in Gill's custody and was transferred by Gill to a private company. In theory, Gill's trash was protected from police interference, but that was just a theory. The state police were keeping an eye on the trash removal company he hired, a small firm made up of two brothers. Waste haulers agreed to separate Gilla's trash until it ends up in the municipal landfill. Don and Andy Bonono were happy to oblige the state police. They were a miserable couple, suffering one misfortune after another. They were also clients of Jimmy O'Reilly, unknown to state police. They obediently sorted Gill's trash, but reported each search to his lawyer. Yes, I would say that when they stop searching through the trash, you can relax or just give them a clean sample of your real DNA. And why should I do this? To prove your innocence. Sam Gill laughed. Yes, of course, that's why I'm paying you, because I'm innocent. At one time, you offered to give them a sample. I offered to send them a sample, not necessarily mine. I see, and you expect me to remain silent? You are my lawyer. You have to. That's right. I can't talk, O'Reilly said. Then he added, I'll let you know about the garbage. Continued, that morning Jimmy sat and thought, and by midday he realized that he had made a decision. It was wrong, but his conscience did not allow him to let Gill leave. So what did you find about stockings, Rebecca? No one sells them at the local market. They can be bought in New York or Boston, and, of course, by mail via the internet. Okay, take the necessary money from the cash register and take the train to the city. I need you back with the stockings by Wednesday evening. Rebecca gave him a hostile look, but then apparently understood. Her face took on a worried expression. Are you sure about that? She asked. Yes. Take the cash and be back by Wednesday evening. Jimmy left work early. It's amazing how representing a serial killer can take the joy out of practicing law. When he arrived home, he found a late-model Chevrolet, apparently a rental, parked in the driveway behind his wife's car. Both of his daughters were in the family room, watching the cartoon Frozen on the 5-foot television given by their aunts. He found his wife, Simone, in the living room with the guests. A couple was sitting on the sofa, consisting of a tall young black man and his companion, a young-looking Asian woman. Her left hand was intertwined with her companion's right hand, and her head and body were pressed against his, as they chatted amicably with Simone. Oh, okay. You're home, Simone said as he entered. We have guests. I see, Jimmy said, noticing a clear element of discomfort in the manner of Simone and the black man. As witnesses in the dock, the two pretended to be at ease, but showed obvious anxiety. An Asian woman broke the tension. Hello, sorry for stopping by, but we were on our way home and couldn't just drive past. Ben flew into Montreal and entered through Plattsburgh, Simone added. Rouse's Point, Ben corrected. Easier than flying straight home, given the problems with quarantine. Jimmy, this is Ben Robinson and his fiancée Amani. Ben and I worked together in Liberia, Simone said. This made Jimmy quite aware of the underlying tension in the room. He returned home a little early, surprising his wife with her guests, one of whom she was too familiar with. He looked at the man carefully. He was tall and well-built, quite beautiful in African-American style. He was a little nervous about meeting his girlfriend's husband, but Jimmy guessed that his demeanor was usually quite casual. He probably had a good sense of humor, and Simone liked humorous men. Jimmy was something of an aberration, too severe for his wife's liking. Jimmy realized that he was subconsciously comparing himself to this man and consciously stopped. He noticed Amani looking at him appreciatively with her dark eyes. She was a short woman. To a Western European, she would have seemed fragile, but her subcontinental heritage gave her an earthy vitality. When her eyes assessed him, he felt that there was a keen intelligence behind them. "Well, I'm glad I came home early," Jimmy said with an enthusiasm that he hoped seemed genuine, but which he did not feel. Coffee and small cakes were served. Amani took the tea. Simone took out some good china. Amani sat a little closer to her man than necessary. There was some rivalry between the women. Jimmy offered some wine, which was refused. "Today we have a short trip ahead of us. We're getting on a plane from JFK to Atlanta tomorrow afternoon," Ben said. "Then why go today?" "Stay with us. We have a guest room. You will leave tomorrow morning to catch your flight. It'll be easier than stopping south of here," Jimmy suggested. Ben didn't want to agree, but Amani said, "Thank you, you are very kind. It was a long day for us." "Okay, let's all go and eat together. The girls will love it, and Ben and Simone will have more time to talk," Jimmy said. Amani thought this was also a great idea, but insisted on payment. In the end, he and Jimmy agreed to split the bill. They ended up at an inexpensive Italian restaurant near the county line. When Simone took the girls to the toilet, Ben left too, leaving Jimmy and Amani alone. "You don't approve," said Amani, sipping the Chianti she had ordered. Jimmy understood what she was trying to say and thought for a moment about playing dumb. But why? "I know that my wife is not faithful when she is not at home, but I have never met one of her lovers before." "So, this is how you understand it? Infidelity? Betrayal? Do you see it differently?" "Yes, everyone needs someone to hold on to, especially when you are in a bad situation and have an uncertain future ahead of you. A man needs a woman, and there isn't a woman who doesn't want a man to cling to her when she's in danger." "And you're not jealous?" he asked. "I did not say that. I am a man, and your wife is very beautiful. And your fiancé is tall and handsome. Don't forget that he's also very skilled in bed," she said, grinning. "We both have a lot to envy." "But?" he asked. "But there is one peculiarity. It's impossible not to feel a certain amount of jealousy, but who wants the person they love to feel lonely and needy? My Ben has returned to me, and as far as I can tell, your wife has returned to you. And I don't have problems?" "Exactly." Jimmy didn't answer right away. This was the question he asked himself. He was not a child, but a man, almost devoid of sentimentality. After all, at this moment he was defending the culprit of multiple murders, and, as the famous Foxy Fitzgerald aptly noted, in representing the culprit, he was taking a deliberate risk. So why such a high moral position when it comes to the woman he loves? "I guess I yearn for the innocence we lost," he finally said. Amani seemed to think, and then smiled. "It's not about what you lose in life, but what you gain from it. You may have lost your girlfriend, but I believe you now have a woman." When Simone came out of the ladies' room, leading her daughters, Ben was already waiting for her. "Vicky, take your sister to the table," Simone said to her eldest daughter. Vicky looked at Ben suspiciously, but answered, "Yes, Mom." When they were alone, Ben said, "I didn't mean to cause you trouble. I just wanted to know how you were doing, and Imani needed reassurance that everything was over between us. She's playing a good game, but I suspect she's a little jealous." "I know. Jimmy knows what I do while I'm away. He just can't come to terms with it. I hope everything works out. I hope that everything will be fine for you and Amani." "I think it will, but is there anything I can do for your situation?" Let's go back. This is the beginning. When Simone arrived at the table, she expected a cool reception, but the atmosphere was relaxed and cheerful. Beth was explaining the intricacies of the storyline from Ayamani's Frozen that both girls enjoyed. Even Ben seemed relaxed as Jimmy helped his youngest daughter tell the story of her favorite movie. For once, Simone thought, they were a normal family. If only this could Conti. The acquittal of Roger Hamilton shocked the community. There was a lot of blame to go around when a clearly guilty man went free. However, the greatest share of the blame fell on the devious machinations of the defense lawyer, so appropriately named Foxy. Lawyer Fitzgerald did little to help his reputation. After the verdict was announced, he did not appear in front of the cameras and slipped out of the courthouse through a side door. However, Foxy's tenure as enemy lawyer number 1 was short-lived, as he was supplanted by the startling news of the arrest of Samuel Gill, a serial killer living among the innocent citizens of Van Patten County. A killer is on the loose due to the duplicitous actions of James O'Reilly, his defense attorney. O'Reilly was involved, Assistant Attorney General Eric Schwartz alleged, in his relationship with suspect Sam Gill. Lawyer O'Reilly crossed the line from defender to conspirator when he advised Gill to replace himself with a double. Moreover, his representation of the interests of the garbage company, where new evidence was found, is a clear conflict of interest, Eric reasoned. The Bonono brothers are longtime clients of James O'Reilly and are key witnesses in any suppression hearing. "Is it true, lawyer?" the judge asked Jimmy. "Yes, Your Honor. By coincidence, I represent witnesses Don and Andy Bonono and appellant Samuel Gill, and I did advise my client not to leave his house unattended while he was away. But I don't see how this has anything to do with the validity of the current demand for Mr. Gill's DNA. Finding a pair of stockings in a trash can is hardly new evidence." "Your Honor," Eric tried to intervene. "It's okay, Mr. Schwartz. You can stop, as I am inclined, based on the previous decision of the Court of Appeals in this case, to grant the state's latest request. This is provided that the testimony of Mr. Bonono and his brother supports the state's position that the unique women's stocking recovered from the trash belongs to Samuel Gill. It follows that I must disqualify Mr. O'Reilly for his dual presentation of the witnesses, and the accused said, the state's right to a new test depends on the testimony of witnesses presented by defense counsel. Conflict exists regardless of guilt. There is a true divergence of interests. However, I see no basis in your allegations of misconduct on the part of Mr. O'Reilly. It is unlikely that he had any prior knowledge of the police's intention to search Mr. Gill's rubbish. Neither the judge nor Eric suggested that this was anything more than the usual legal elevation of form over substance. This was a common legal ploy in the public interest. No one thought that Jimmy was actually taking part in this game. That he was, in fact, involved, was an actor, and not just a defender. With O'Reilly's firm removed from defending Samuel Gill, the public, or at least its accusers, breathed a sigh of relief. The wicked defender was eliminated. Evidence from the killer's bin was due to go to trial, and he would have to give his DNA. There was no mention of the police's unsuccessful attempts to collect Gill's DNA from the discarded items, which were unsuccessful only because no matches were found. Carrie Wilson watched the public outcry against her former lover with jealousy. This fish really stank, but why was not entirely clear. Jimmy O'Reilly is too shrewd to be fooled so easily. Something really stank. But Anthony Greco had other concerns. "Is this guy still the special prosecutor on that correction case?" Tony asked, bursting into her office with his copy of the latest lawyer editorial. "Actually, I have Jimmy O'Reilly's final report in my basket. The special counsel's case is closed and within budget," Carrie replied. "Okay, the governor needs some distance from this piece of defense trash. Do you know that he was their teacher?" "I thought it was just that little shit Fitzgerald, but it looks like the governor also had O'Reilly as his student," Tony muttered, sitting down in the chair. Carrie was well aware of the governor's professorial relationship with the lawyers in question. The governor bragged about it to everyone who would listen. In particular, he was proud to coach Foxy Fitzgerald in mock trials. Tony's dislike for Fitzgerald was equally obvious. It was another man's dislike for his mistress's husband. She waited for Tony to go about his business. but he still sat motionless in her office. "Is there anything else?" she asked. "Well, actually, I would like to know your opinion," he said. But then he paused. She waited for him to continue, but there was an awkward silence before he continued. "I'm going to invite Susan to the governor's ball at the mansion," he said. "You mean Mrs. Fitzgerald? She goes by the name Singleton, and I hope she will soon become Mrs. Anthony Greco." "I see she's divorcing her husband?" asked Carrie, who had not heard anything about this before. "We haven't discussed this, but I assume yes, as soon as I ask her to marry me." "Wait, what are you telling me? Are you saying that you intend to propose to a woman who is still in a relationship with her husband?" Tony was starting to get irritated. In his opinion, no woman would want Foxy Fitzgerald instead of him. "I know Susan, and she needs a real man. Someone who can make her happy, once she sees that I'm serious. And if she doesn't, serious that is, then she'll get serious when she realizes we have a future," Tony countered. "Well, if you have decided everything, then what is the question?" Carrie asked. "How serious do you think it will be if I take her to the governor's ball without her husband?" "Yes, of course. You can't ask her to marry you when her husband is standing next to you," Carrie said, considering the possible consequences. "The governor just hired her as his public relations consultant." "It wouldn't be good if she immediately got involved in a scandal," Tony said. "No, but this lady does PR. I'm sure she can come up with a convincing reason for her husband's absence, and so as not to hurt your pride. Neither she nor you are the stars of the ball. They will be the governor and various politicians and celebrities. Will the governor like this? Probably not, but it will be nothing more than a blip on his radar." Carrie finished reasoning. "Anything else?" Carrie asked. "No, that's it," Tony said as he left. After he left, Carrie thought about the situation. Just in case, she decided to take control of the situation. She will ask to put Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald on the guest list, but will tell the ball secretary to leave the invitation at the door. And then inspiration struck her. Why not invite James O'Reilly's family? Simone O'Reilly is a heroine in her own right. The governor publicly supported returning healthcare workers. A photo of him dancing with one of them could ease public concerns and show the governor in a good light. The panic had subsided in the previous months, and the governor could now reap the benefits of his bold stance. "I wonder what Jimmy will look like in a fancy dress," she thought. The governor's reception and ball was officially held at the Victorian Governor's Mansion on Eagle Street in Albany in honor of the extensive renovation it had undergone. It was said to be the home of the governors of New York, but few of them spent more than one night there. The governors of New York live in New York. In those cases where they have to spend the night in Albany, they find better accommodation than this old and inconvenient building. The mansion was supposedly haunted for a long time, but in reality it was just an old and poorly maintained building, groaning with age and countless ill-conceived renovations and additions. It just kept popping into people's minds at night until Governor Kincaid decided to set things right. Halfway through his 4-year renovation of the building, he decided to throw a party. Not for fun, but to start a campaign for his candidacy for the White House. This was the only house he really wanted to live in. Kincaid didn't mind when he was told his new PR consultant was coming. She did more for his campaign than just show insight. She was DeVoe on her mother's side with all that entails, and the daughter of Joe Singleton. DeVoe was old money, and Singleton was new. Susan DeVoe. Singleton was personally acquainted with most of the super-rich people in what is rightly called the Empire State. The fact that her husband would not be present was unfortunate, but not a great loss. Stephen Fitzgerald would hardly be an addition to any gathering. His current notoriety may have been good for his practice, but he was hardly the kind of person you'd want to be photographed with. What Fitzgerald got, O'Reilly got too. The governor will be required to have his photo taken with the eminent Dr. Simona O'Reilly, who recently returned from Africa. He'll hug her and make some quotable comment when asked about her recent quarantine. There were no quotes yet, but we tried to come up with something suitable. The governor's ball was scheduled to kick off his presidential campaign. Carrie was as pleased with the preparations as her boss. The fact that she was walking down a crooked path did not occur to her. She will, of course, be there accompanied by her fiancé, Raymond Emerson. Ray will dance with her. The couple will smile for the cameras, but when no one is looking, Ray's eyes will be on Assembly Majority Leader Jose Martin Perez, a seventh-term Assembly member from the Bronx. A tall, handsome man in his 50s with a wife 25 years his junior. Ima Martin Perez is a former Miss Ima Klein, an international model with a taste for the finer things in life. There's no denying that she's attractive and attracts men faster than her Alfa Romeo racks up speeding tickets. Until now, her assembler husband had protected her from both dangers of the fast life. As majority attorney, Raymond Emerson had a lot of contact with Mr. and Mrs. Martin Perez. But during the first hour of dancing, he studiously avoided them. Susan Singleton appeared on the arm of Anthony Greco. If anyone thought that she would go on stage quietly, they were mistaken. She appeared in a black couture dress with an emerald necklace worth more than all the other sparkles on display that evening combined. He and the governor exchanged greetings and expressed mutual regret at the absence of the lady's husband. "He left on urgent business, another nasty murder trial," Susan said. The governor expressed his regrets and, as Foxy's former teacher, took credit for his students' obvious skill. They then went their separate ways, the governor continuing to greet his guests while Susan attended to the room filled with her wealthy friends and relatives. Greco followed her, clearly eclipsing the woman he sought to possess. The O'Reillys arrived shortly after Susan and before the arrival of the town's mayor, whose arrival signaled the start of the 20-piece orchestra's performance. These are strong musicians with a wide repertoire. Carrie approved the playlist and set it up for 2 90-minute performances with an hour-long break in the middle for speeches and interaction with the audience. Each set started with a mix of fast and slow musical numbers, but transitioned into mostly sweet, slow songs midway through. An hour after the first dance set, Tony Greco made his move. He invited Susan to go out into the garden. Carrie watched him. Ray was by then dancing with Mrs. Martin Perez. It was their first dance of the evening, but not their last. Carrie took this opportunity to arrange for Simone to dance with the governor. While photographers were busy capturing the governor dancing with the handsome doctor, who had been so brutally quarantined by his political rivals, Carrie took the opportunity to dance with the doctor's husband. "My turn, Jimmy," Carrie said. He did not hesitate, but hugged her and pulled her towards him. "You feel good," she said. "And you feel as good as you look," he said. She wore a tight silver dress that showed off her cleavage down to her navel and had a high slit above her right leg. She specifically chose this dress to show off, knowing that Jimmy's wife would be there. Simone O'Reilly wore a more subdued green dress. The dress was chosen with the expectation that another woman would see it. Simone looked surprisingly elegant, but not sexy. Carrie wanted to be sultry and achieved this, but Simone played the role of a good wife. It was a performance worthy of Susan Singleton. When Simone's dance with the governor ended, she was immediately intercepted by another dance partner. "Did you set it all up?" Jimmy asked Carrie. "We invited you to show how we support your wife's courageous activities." "All the politicians will want to dance and take pictures," Carrie replied, "and I will have time with her husband." Carrie led Jimmy out the side door into the garden. The evening was dark, but the area was bathed in light from the state capitol South Mall, a complex of office buildings and a saucer-shaped theater structure. "My God, how beautiful it is on a night like this," Jimmy said. "That was Rocky's intention," Carrie agreed. An elaborate and impractical shopping center, a city within the city of Albany, was built by Nelson Rockefeller. The scale was not the same. Its buildings were too large for ordinary people, but there was something to see there, even from a distance. Jimmy started to say something, but Carrie stopped him by putting her fingers to his lips and pushing him aside. Looking over her shoulder, he saw a tall couple bathed in the silver light of the mall. They locked in a deep kiss, and he would have recognized them anywhere. It was Mrs. Fitzgerald and Tony Greco. When they were far enough away, Carrie said, "Tony proposes to her." "A proposal?" "He asks her to marry him." I may be wrong, but she looks like Stephen Fitzgerald's wife. It is, but Tony doesn't see a problem with it. Then I'd say he's both brave and stupid, Jimmy whispered. Do you think Foxy will mind? She asked. I have a better question for you. What will Mrs. Martin Prez do when she finds out about her husband and your fiancé? Carrie covered her mouth to suppress her laughter. So, you noticed? The cutesy game between your wife and your man was clever, but not entirely believable. This raises an obvious question. Why are they playing such a game? But as soon as you ask this question, it becomes clear what is really happening. So how long have you known, and who else is involved? Emma is aware and plays her part, as do I, Carrie said. Ray and the assemblyman go back to Ray's college days. We play as a couple for our mutual benefit. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I never thought that everything would be so serious with us. Jimmy tried to see her eyes in the dim light, but all it gave him was the kiss she gave him. I'm sorry, my love, she said. I deceived you. Ray and I are good friends. He needed a companion, and I needed the support that connections could give me. This led me to the governor's headquarters, but I got my current job thanks to my own merits. Jimmy could only shake his head. This explained a lot. He thought for a second to feel all the consequences. Do you think everything is serious with us? Yes, I didn't want it, but I believe it happened. The music died down and some of the guests began to leave. Carrie pulled away from Jimmy. I'd better go play governor's assistant until the music starts again, she said. Jimmy watched her leave and saw Susan pull away from Greco and head inside. Mrs. Fitzgerald doesn't look so happy, he thought. But when Susan returned to the mansion, Simone came out. She looked around until she saw Jimmy standing to the side of the garden. Approaching her husband, Simone nodded towards the office buildings of the shopping center and said, A nice place? Did you admire the view? Yes, he answered. And something else. Are you done dancing with the big shots, or are you just relaxing? The music has stopped, but when it starts again, I would like to dance with my husband, she said, taking his hand. And I would like that, he replied. Is it true? Yes, Justice. Jimmy, I already asked, but I'm asking again. Do you love Carrie? He suppressed his overly ready response and considered her question. He didn't love the person Carrie thought he was, but such a person didn't exist. This woman was a young girl hiding her secret from the whole world. He could have loved this girl if he had been free, but was he free? He looked at his wife and said, No, I don't love her, but I would love her if I didn't love you. I just can't imagine myself loving two women at the same time. Simone nodded her head seriously. She didn't like his answer. Good night. So different from the nights in Africa, and at the same time strangely similar. On a night like this, I want more than anything to be with you, she said. But we both know that you won't stay with me. You'll go back to Africa or someplace like that because that's where you need to be, he said. She squeezed his hand tightly and moved closer to whisper, I am so sorry. He clung to her and kissed the tears that began to appear in the corners of her eyes. I know, he whispered back. The music started playing again. He hugged her and said, Come on, you owe me a couple of dances. Ray Emerson walked his bride home to her apartment on State Street. It is alleged that they lived in this apartment together, as well as his, in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. In a sense, they did share apartments, but not beds. Tired? Ray asked the visibly tired Carrie. Yes, no matter how well you plan, there is always so much to do, and all these details that go wrong if you don't keep an eye on them, she answered. Is your boyfriend one of these details? He asked. You're almost jealous. I am worrying about you. He seems very passionate about his wife. She is a very beautiful woman, although you are much sexier in this dress. Thank you. I didn't think you noticed. Does he treat you well? Ray was worried about her, and his concern was genuine. He's good to me, but underneath his tough exterior, he's kind and gentle. Defending serial killers, Ray said, pouring himself some scotch from the bottle they kept in the kitchen cabinet. Carrie busied herself preparing a cup of herbal tea. The drinks were supposed to relax them after a busy evening. Carrie allowed herself 2 glasses of wine during the evening, and Ray limited himself to soda. Carrie's fiddling with the kettle gave her time to think. I don't know where Jimmy is in the serial killer case. Yes, he fought the DNA test, but there was something wrong with the subsequent arrest. He's too smart to let his client get caught like that. Unless, she said, pouring tea. Do you know something? Ray asked. No, but I suspect it has something to do with the stocking found in the trash can. How? I can't say, but throwing it up would be like him, she suggested. A dangerous move if caught. Cocky, yes, but as far as I know, Jimmy, he plans to not get caught. He looks like your type of man. Oh, that's true, but such men are too expensive a luxury for women in my profession. Are you trying to convince me or yourself? Maybe both, she said. Look, I want you to know that if you need anything from our agreement, let me know, Ray said. She knew he was sincere. Carrie kissed him on the cheek and said, Well, it won't be today and not soon. And now I need to sleep. It all started very strange for them. John Martin was a master of mass claims. This half-Jewish, half-Puerto Rican lawyer with large fees bought himself a seat in the assembly in the Bronx. John Martin, now known as José Martin Prez, having retired from active legal practice, filled his non-political time by teaching at Yale University. His seminar on mass torts was very popular and was limited to just 15 lucky students per semester. Carrie Wilson was a first-year law student at Yale University, the nation's top-ranked law school. She was eager to fill the only elective she had for the spring semester. Carrie was an excellent student, graduating with honors from Wellesley. Law school was a sobering shower for her. The academic work was very hard, with a hectic class and study schedule of 60 hours a week. Carrie could live with that. What she hated was moral character. That one consisted of 2/3 hypocrisy and 1/3 cynicism. This is a culture that has raised immoral graduates, on the one hand, stigmatizing the lack of conscience, and on the other, striving for even greater material security. In the spring semester, she was supposed to do an internship, helping out at a legal aid office or an anti-poverty clinic to gain practical experience and make the law school look like a benefactor rather than a training ground for social leeches. Carrie's classmates were determined to argue business and do real work. Carrie wanted to engage in politics, which, oddly enough, was an alternative to social conscience. Martin Prez's seminar gave her the opportunity to network with policymakers while avoiding group practice, at least for the first year. Carrie received a recommendation for a seminar on mass delinquency from her professor, who was also a Wellesley graduate, but Carrie still had to interview to get into a popular class taught by a tall, handsome, and very lonely professor. The casting interviewer was Ray Emerson, an equally handsome, some said handsome, teaching assistant to the Honorable Martin Prez. Ray interviewed Carrie at the law school cafe. He conducted the interview over a latte, but mostly flirted with a pretty first-year student. Coffee led to a date, and then another. Carrie may have graduated summa cum laude from Wellesley, but her single-sex education did not extend to men. She was not a virgin, having lost her virginity during spring break on South Padre Island. It was short, painful, and disposable. After returning home, she tried her best to make the next experience more enjoyable. But she had no luck. No matter how hard Carrie tried, she constantly met with scoundrels who were always ready and thought only of their own merits. Athletes are narcissists, and nerds are in love with their technology. One group was ready to rape in public, while the other clumsily shied away in the dark. Then she met Ray, a gentleman, in every sense of the word. He was funny and treated her like a special person. He was affectionate, but not sexually aggressive. Carrie dated Ray throughout the spring semester. They didn't have sex, but she was too naive to care. Ray and the assemblyman arranged a summer internship for her. In Albany, she had a room in a university dorm on Western Avenue. She was paid a small salary to make copies and sort mail for the Assembly Education Committee. She also assisted junior Assembly staff who had little or no staff. Martin Prez's wealth has already made him an influential man. Ray was the Assemblyman's right-hand man. Their office was located in the building of the Legislative Assembly of Abstract Architecture. In those days, the upper corridors took on a somewhat shabby appearance, but Martin Prez converted his interior office into an executive office, finished in leather and hardwood. Ray's office was smaller than his boss's, but no one had seen a member of the Assembly not be the first to greet Ray. There was an exception to this last rule. Carrie was welcomed earlier for a change. It was the third week of August. 4 weeks earlier, the Legislative Assembly had gone into summer recess. The late end of holidays is a result of school funding problems. New York followed an arcane method of funding public education, largely through property taxes. The state provided subsidies, but this prompted a series of lawsuits by New York, which the state lost, thereby exacerbating a bad system. The minions working in the Capitol for the Assembly Education Committee had finally printed all the various materials and had them ready for the next legislative session. On the last Friday of her internship, Carrie left early. She was scheduled to return to work at the law school next week. But first there was a chance to take Ray on a warm summer weekend to Lake George. They had a weekend planned on a large lake in the southeast corner of the Adirondack Mountains, part nature reserve, part beach town. Lake George was a place where young people could relax and unwind. The elevator quickly took her to the 10th floor of an empty building. Assemblyman Martin Prez's outside office was empty. The chairs were close to the tables. The computers were turned off. A knock and a turn of the knob revealed that Ray's office was also empty. She was considering whether to sit and wait for him or call him on his cell phone when she heard a groan coming from the Assemblyman's inner office. Jose Martin Prez was allegedly on Martha's Vineyard with his new girlfriend, model Emma Klein. Perhaps Ray is working out on the life cycle machine, she thought. The Assemblyman kept an expensive stationary bicycle in the corner of his office. Having made one of the worst decisions of her life, she decided to look into the inner office. There was a training session going on there. Ray leaned over the assembly table. Behind him stood John Jose, having Ray in his ass. The two were so engrossed that they did not notice the door opening, nor the shock on the young woman's face, nor the way she hastily closed the door. Carrie ran out of the office. The sound of the front door slamming alarmed the couple in the inner office, but by the time they responded, she had already descended 5 floors of stairs. She didn't stop until she reached the building's lobby, which was often under video surveillance. Entering this huge lobby, she burst into tears openly. His inhuman proportions added to her grief. This room, which played the role of an Arab palace and many futuristic interiors, became a cold and merciless place for a young girl shedding tears of lost love. She didn't know she was in love. I didn't think carefully about the course of my life. She went to law school because it was her next step. She chose public service instead of practicing law to escape the callousness of the law. I fell in love with a good man to save myself from the bastards. So what now? Esther Markowitz served 14 terms as a state senator. After 30-plus years in the Assembly and State Senate, during which she represented her East Side district of Manhattan, she was preparing for retirement. She will not run again. The jackals vying for her safe Democratic seat had already begun insulting each other, and the primary was still more than a year away. Esther has fought these battles many times, training her bones in the brutal political world of New York. But when it was time to leave, she felt herself soften. Perhaps that is why the Jewish grandmother, the former alter ego of a hardline politician, stopped when she saw the young woman crying. "Can I help?" Esther asked the clearly upset Carrie. "No, no one can help me now," Carrie whispered, trying to wipe away her tears with the back of her hands. "Oh, nonsense. Let's go have a cup of tea in my office. I have a very beautiful office, the result of many years of telling people one thing and doing the opposite." Esther laughed at her own joke and took Carrie's arm, leading the upset girl into her cozy office on the 4th floor, a women's office that was in every way different from the leather-trimmed office on the 10th floor from which Carrie had recently escaped. There, Esther prepared tea and gave napkins to wipe Carrie's tears. "You are the girl that Ray Emerson showed everyone, isn't it?" Esther asked. Carrie just nodded. "I saw or heard something that was not intended for you." Another nod in response. "Oh God, it's like being young again and being able to understand such pain," Esther said with a slight sigh. Carrie raised her head and looked intently at the woman. "Try to understand, dear. Handsome and wealthy John Martin may change his name to something more Latino. He can participate in the Puerto Rican Day Parade, but he can't come out as gay in a district that is 60% African and Latino. I feel so stupid. I should have guessed. Not at all. We, intelligent women, are not used to dealing with men. It's something in the genes that says, the best in class don't get along well with guys. Maybe this is God's way of making sure that girls from the bottom of the unit get their share." You said we. My first husband is Mr. Markowitz, a distinguished realtor and broker who pampered a not-so-pretty girl who was the top valedictorian of her class at Queens College. Being 15 years older than me, he stunned me. It took me 5 years of childless marriage to find out the truth. How do you like this? But in my defense, being a good Jewish girl, I was a virgin on my wedding night, and he was so attentive. I really thought my mom was lying to me about what marriage was. Oh, it's not that we didn't have intercourse, but it wasn't consummated and neither of us really enjoyed it. "But?" Carrie asked, remembering what she had heard. Esther smiled knowingly. "Oh, in the end, we had children, 2 boys and a girl. Just not in the biblical sense. The wonderful thing about the Jewish faith is that only the mother's religion matters." "Jewish mother? Jewish child? What do you mean by that? That John or Jose, or whatever he calls himself today, is a rich and influential man. He can secure your future, just as my husband, Henry Markowitz, secured mine. He paid for my early campaign efforts. He got me into the Assembly and then into the State Senate. He needed me. 40 years ago, things were very different for the likeness of a man. Ray and his boss need you. Stop crying and make yourself useful. The world you are trying to enter is harsh. Get everything out of your buddy. Take advantage of all the advantages that come your way. And what about love? You must look for it, work for it, and on it. Henry Markowitz was a good and fair man, but I never loved him. Not like her second husband. I had to keep searching until I found my love. It didn't happen just like in the movies. I found my Charlie a few years after the start of my political career. He was not very attractive to look at, but everything about him was masculine. A good, strong man who never beats women, ready to give his life for his family. Yes, I kissed a lot of frogs during the search. Charlie's bed wasn't the first one I slept in outside of marriage, Esther said, looking a little distant as she remembered. But how did you know, since you've already been deceived before? It wasn't like a great romance. It was not a spring day, but a murderously hot August evening on which a cold breeze suddenly blew from the ocean. We were sitting on a park bench. He hugged me, and I stuck my hand into his. When I felt his rough male hand, it was like the first time, but I knew that I would never let it go again. We had 2 girls, twins. It wasn't easy, and I needed medical help to conceive. By that time, I was already old and 5 years older than him. I was far at the last political level. Power in its own right. By then, Henry was glad to be rid of me. Times have changed so much that people knew everything, but said nothing. I don't know, Carrie thought out loud. Think about it and don't do anything rash. Consider your options and don't turn down anything. Everyone who spoke about you said only good things. Those petty politicians at the bottom have no way of rewarding what you have done for them except by telling others about you. In a short time, you have created a good reputation for yourself. Do not throw it away. But it's time for me to go so I can be home by sunset. Today is Friday and I have a long way to go. With that, Esther ushered Carrie out, but stopped to hug her as they left the legislative building. In the university dormitory where she rented a room, Raymond was waiting for her. He looked worried. He couldn't know for sure whether it was her in the outer office or what she might have seen. He both hoped and feared that it was her, afraid of her reaction and hoping she was in the office so he could prevent what she knew from spreading. Carrie didn't make him sweat. By the time she crossed Albany and found herself on the Western Avenue campus, she had decided to take Esther's advice. Ray was relieved but worried. He was haunted by guilt and was saddened that he had lost her respect. Carrie treated him calmly, but, like a smart girl, made it clear that honesty was necessary to continue the relationship. She dealt with John Jose differently. By the time Carrie met the older man after the incident, she had already prepared. She had facts about the relationship between two men, the older dominant one and the attractive younger one, a handsome young man and his handsome senior partner, the leader of the assembly and his assistant lover who obeyed every order. She knew that there were notes of sadomasochism in this relationship. No longer naive, the girl met the skillful José Martín Pérez, Speaker of the majority in the assembly, and began to put forward her conditions to play the protective female role in a sexless relationship. This is not blackmail, she told herself. This is a service on a long-term basis for a series of ongoing services. Next was the wedding ring. Humble but personable, and a move into the governor's office for an entry-level position with support as she rose higher. Carrie never looked back. She would never walk with her Raymond to the church altar. But she didn't need it and didn't want it. She achieved success in the governor's office, largely on her own merits. She was a junior aide, but the formidable Governor Kincaid relied on her more and more. She managed to graduate from Yale Law School with honors and get a full-time job on the governor's staff. Life was wonderful. And then James O'Reilly showed up. Samuel Gill pounded his fist on the desk of Frank Thomas, former district attorney and prominent defense attorney. "I cannot believe this. These stockings were clearly planted. I only got home because that incompetent O'Reilly said the police had stopped searching my trash and I could go back." Lawyer Thompson was a little puzzled. "You want to say that you deliberately avoided the police?" "Yes. Are you stupid or not listening? I basically left town so the police couldn't get my DNA. The man in the house was a detective working for O'Reilly's sister. All this was done so that they could not obtain my DNA. Well, I don't see how this will help us. You yourself gave the garbage bags to the collectors. This Don Buono says you personally delivered the package to him and his brother Andy is supporting him. Don't you understand the police planted the stockings? Look, this is not a trial, but a hearing to determine whether you should give your DNA. Unless there is a statement from someone that the evidence was planted, well, you may be forced to give a DNA sample. Well, call the detective O'Reilly hired. He may say that I have nothing to do with garbage. Okay, what's his name? How should I know? Just ask O'Reilly. He refuses to talk to me, citing a conflict of interest. Then his sister. She claims she knows nothing about your case. Can't you summon them to court? Make them talk? Yes, but if I do this, you will have to waive your attorney-client privilege. Even if the sister is not a lawyer, she acted under his control. Once you give up the privilege, everything they know will be known. I don't think we need this. When Samuel Gill was indicted in New Jersey, the local press covered the case as if it were a local trial. Jimmy O'Reilly was vilified again, and for greater credibility, they took on Foxy Fitzgerald. Both men didn't suffer much from the extra fame. By the end of the year, Fitzgerald had, against all odds, become a junior partner in his firm, and O'Reilly had hired his secretary as a staff attorney to handle the extra work. Carrie Wilson could only shake her head and marvel at the curious nature of the profession she studied for, but never intended to work in. Better to sit in a corner in the Capitol than to navigate this crazy world where up is down and left may be right, but never right. Still, it was jarring to see Toni Greco sitting in her small office complaining about lawyers. Shakespeare is right. The first thing to do is kill them all. I don't think this phrase should be taken seriously, otherwise the villain wouldn't have said it. But tell me what is particularly bothering you today. She doesn't want to leave this slug of a husband. She plans to have a child with him. I understand that we are discussing Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is planning to have children with her husband. How unusual. I understand why you're upset, Carrie said, trying her best to suppress a smile. A woman loves me, and I am twice as much a man as he is. I don't understand. She has much more money than him, and her father insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Why does she stay with him? Tony grumbled. Maybe she loves him, Carrie said, and added, seeing Tony flinch. Well, I'm just admitting that possibility. Is this what O'Reilly is telling you? That he loves his wife, Tony said with a grin at the man he liked only slightly better than Stephen Fitzgerald. He doesn't need to tell me. He shows it. Some men are like that. They fall in love and can't break free, no matter the provocation, Carrie said. But she was generous. She knew she could win the fight with Simone O'Reilly. The question is, should she fight? The second lady was already packing for her next trip abroad. This would leave her Jimmy free and untethered and knowing that his wife would be sleeping in another man's bed. The time has come, but can she give up what she has? Jimmy won't accept anything less than total commitment. Carrie thought about Tony's problem. The woman he wanted was an amazingly beautiful creature, but with the morals of an alley cat. Susan Singleton Fitzgerald wanted what she had. Carrie knew that Singleton and her father were strong allies of Carrie's boss, the governor. Tony's desire was mixed with a considerable amount of ambition, but his usually sound political mind was dominated by sexual attraction to this woman. This passion made him blind when it came to Susan. What did she see in him? Tony almost whined. Tony, there is no simple answer to this question, but you have to admit that this man has great looks, and whether you like it or not, women are attracted to his looks. Tony left unsatisfied, and Carrie returned to the current crisis. The governor received an urgent call from the Cardinal of the Diocese of New York. The Cardinal wanted to meet him, and as soon as possible. The request was unusual since Christmas was only 10 days away. A busy time for the Cardinal, and this year for the governor. The legislature was still in business because lawmakers needed to pass a spending bill that included a pay raise for themselves. The governor refused to sign the bill unless new taxes were passed. The legislature was deadlocked, and the governor was needed in Albany. The cardinal insisted on a personal meeting in New York. The request was strange, but Carrie was tasked with making the meeting possible. This required the use of a state aircraft. Using the state's meager air fleet is always fraught with paperwork and tricks. To cover the trip, Carrie needed to settle state affairs in Manhattan. Otherwise, during negotiations on tax increases, the opposition will scream about waste. Jimmy O'Reilly fanned out the tickets in his hand. He thought about how much trouble and expense he had to incur. 4 tickets to see the Nutcracker at Lincoln Center. They were worth their weight in gold. He planned everything. They had planned it together, Simone and him, as one last family holiday before she left again. Jimmy's daughters were delighted. They really wanted to see the ballot. Jimmy had no interest in ballot at all, but wanted to be there with his daughters and wife. He had been working for months to make this Christmas special. She and Simone came to an understanding, an imperfect compromise that did not suit either one. When they are apart, they have an open marriage. But when Simone returns home, she must be his faithful wife. He could do whatever he wanted if he was careful. When Simone is away, she doesn't ask what he's doing or who he's seeing, and she keeps him in the dark about her sex life. This was all Simone wanted, but Jimmy retained the right to date other women even after Simone returned home. She knew that this was more of a threat than an actual condition. After the governor's ball, Jimmy did not sleep with Carrie. However, Simone knew that this woman was waiting for him on the eve of the new year. Simone made a hard bargain with her husband, but got him back. They shared a bed again, and not just to sleep. The agreement fell apart as soon as it began. "I need to leave. Important meeting," she said. "Did we promise your daughters, or did you forget?" He answered angrily. "Jimmy, try to understand that lives are at stake. I'll be back before Christmas." "What about the Nutcracker? You only want girls to watch it if they are accompanied by their father." I thought we were creating memories that would last a lifetime. Now they will only remember that their mother was not there. Come on, put the blame on me. I am a bad wife, and now also a bad mother. Well, maybe so, but I will rest easy knowing that I did everything I could to save every life I could. He could only grumble in response, like an offended child. For once, you would put your family first. It's not fair, and you know it. Listen, I'll go to New York with you. I can catch a plane from JFK on Saturday morning. Then you take the girls to ballet in the afternoon as planned. On Thursday, they actually went by train. On Friday, we spent Christmas shopping with the girls. The mother and daughters were shopping for clothes, and the father was trying to look interested. An overly guilty mother indulged her daughters. They explored Times Square and ate a late dinner at a home-style Italian restaurant. Back at the hotel, we put the girls in one double bed while Mom and Dad got ready to go into the other. It was already about 11 when the phone rang in the room. Simone was already asleep, preparing for her morning departure. "Hi, Jimmy. This is Carrie," said the voice on the phone. "Carrie, what the hell?" "Damn, that's right. I had a damn hard time tracking you down. It's not a good idea to turn off your cell phone." Checking his phone, he said, "I didn't turn it off. The battery died." "Well, I wouldn't like to think that you're avoiding me," the woman he was avoiding said with some sarcasm. "Sorry, this must be important. What do you need?" "We need the favor you owe the governor," she said. Something about the way she said it sent a chill down his spine. "Are you still here?" she asked. "Yes, whatever is needed." "I need you to leave the modest hotel where you are staying within 20 minutes. "Should I wear a jacket? I only took a sports jacket with me on this trip." "Wear your pajamas if you have to, but be outside in 20 minutes. A Lincoln City car will pick you up." "Sorry, but I have to hang up," she said. The hotel was small and had a dual purpose. Half the building was fully occupied by residents serving those who work in New York but live elsewhere. Late at night, the lobby was small and quiet, with only one staff member working there. He was young and surprisingly cheerful, and cheerful for late in the evening. He greeted Jimmy with a wave of his hand and a cheerful smile. "There's a car waiting outside the door," the employee said. Walking through the doors, it was impossible not to notice the Lincoln Town car sitting on the curb of West 45th Street, or a large and menacing elderly man leaning on the wing. "Mr. O'Reilly?" he asked. "Yes," Jimmy answered. "I'm Don Pleasant, Special Assistant to the Governor," he said, opening the back door. After ushering Jimmy into the back seat, Pleasant took the front seat next to the driver, and the city car quickly pulled out into the street, a street as crowded near midnight as most places are at noon. They drove onto the avenue and rushed towards the city center. We slowed down only to go around Central Park. When they reached East 80th Street, after 2 blocks they turned right and stopped in front of a 4-story building. Jimmy expected to be taken to the governor's office on the west side, but he was taken to the east side, 2 blocks from the park. Don Pleasant led him into the house as the city car pulled away. The governor's city residence was a step below the palace. 2 brownstone houses joined together. The lower floor opened into a large double salon on one side and a ballroom on the other. Don directed him up the wide central staircase to the 2nd floor and a small upper salon. Waiting in this room was Edward Kincaid, governor of New York, with his personal assistant, Carrie Wilson. They sat in chairs with backs, located at right angles to each other, around a small oval table. There was a document lying face down on the table. "Good evening, Mr. O'Reilly," said the governor, "and thank you for coming." "I was reminded that I am in your debt," Jimmy said, looking at Carrie, who had neither her usual self-control nor her constant political smile. Don left, closing the door behind him, and only the 3 of them remained in the room. "Yes, but thanks anyway. Could you please read this?" Kincaid said, indicating that Jimmy should take one of the remaining chairs around the table. The governor unfolded the document and pushed it towards Jimmy. Jimmy began quickly scanning the 3-page document the way lawyers learn to read, looking for meaning between the words. But Jimmy quickly stopped scanning, returned to the beginning of the document, and began again, very carefully. While he was reading, there was deathly silence in the room. A full 20 minutes passed before anyone spoke. Jimmy placed the document back on the table, face down, pushed it back towards the governor and said, "I understand that you believe what is written in this report, and it actually came to you from the indicated addressee. Yes, I have a high degree of confidence that it is accurate, and in fact, the cardinal gave it to me personally." "You must be worried," Jimmy said. Kincaid smiled. "A very gentle way to determine my current mental state." "Can I ask what you want from me?" Jimmy asked. "I want you to sort this out. Make it go away. Why entrust this to a lawyer you barely know?" "I reason simply. You know the sides. Carrie has complete confidence in you, and you owe me a favor," the governor said. "Participation in such a business is a very great service. I'm grateful that you helped my wife, but This is not the favor I had in mind," the governor said as Carrie shifted awkwardly from her seat. Jimmy raised one eyebrow questioningly, and the governor gave an answer. "The state police are hardly skilled investigators, but even an incompetent one can stumble upon the truth. You very cleverly replaced your client, Samuel Gill, with another person, thereby avoiding accidentally providing the authorities with his DNA. But this man who works for your sister put stockings in the trash can. The police suspect this, but have not questioned the man about who gave him the stockings and will not question him. I made sure that there was no investigation beyond what had already happened. This is the service I'm talking about, Attorney O'Reilly. Clearly blackmail. No, of course not. I won't expose you. I respect your actions. Under the circumstances, your actions were correct and courageous. However, you are in my debt, and I, of course, need your help," the governor said, pointing to the document. "I see," Jimmy replied, and reaching out, took the document, then folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. "Thank you. Carrie will take you back to the hotel," the governor said, standing up and offering his hand. The ride back to Jimmy's hotel started out calmly. The man was lost in his thoughts, and the woman sneaked glances while driving, trying to read them. They were in Ray's little Audi, which she had used while in the city. "He's a good man," she said in a quiet voice, barely more than a whisper. Jimmy didn't answer, so she continued, "He was a good governor and brought great benefits to the state. He can do a lot for the country. He may never have that opportunity," he said. "You must help him." "I can only do this. You can never trust that something like this will remain a secret." She nodded understandingly. "But will you do your best?" she said. He did not answer and then asked, "Do you like the ballet The Nutcracker? Of course, this is absolutely wonderful, but it's impossible to get tickets." "I have tickets. Tomorrow afternoon I'm taking my daughters. We have a free ticket. You want to go?" Carrie thought about this invitation and what it might mean. "Yes, but what are their names? You never told me." "Victoria. She's the eldest. She's 9. We call her Vicky. And Elizabeth is 7. We call her Beth." "What time should I meet you?" "Let's say at noon in front of Lincoln Center. This will give us an hour to find our seats and get settled before the show starts. If we are a little late, please wait. We'll take my wife to the airport for the 7:30 flight to Paris." "Okay, I'd better take you back to the hotel. To be on time, you will need to get up early." Jimmy and his daughters accompanied Simone to the security gate. At 6 in the morning, the lines were long but not crazy. He watched his wife hug her daughters and promised to be home for Christmas. He later lowered their expectations in case Mom didn't make it back to Santa. Then he hugged his wife, kissed her, and wished her a happy journey. A lot has changed between husband and wife. The family remained intact, but the marriage changed. He walked his daughters through the airport to the taxi area and back to Manhattan, to the hotel. He offered them a quick breakfast, and after a short nap, dressed them for the trip to Lincoln Center. The girls were in a good mood, despite their mother's departure. During a taxi ride across the city to the west side of Central Park and the David H. Koch Theater, he told his daughters they would be meeting his girlfriend. At first, the girls showed no interest, but when Carrie showed up, everything changed. She had been waiting since noon by the fountain on the theater square, watching each taxi disembark its passengers. I was nervous and told myself that I needed to pull myself together. They are just little girls, and he is just her current bed partner. Carrie pushed out of her head the thought that Jimmy, too, was an accomplice in the impending conspiracy. There was no doubt that she would help the governor. Keeping his secrets and helping him was more than just a job for her. Not only was she loyal to him, she believed in the man she hoped to bring to the White House. The fact that Jimmy agreed to help only strengthened her belief in the rightness of their cause. That her feelings for Jimmy were stronger than she had imagined was now obvious to her. And so she fidgeted, and her nerves went under her skin as each yellow taxi stopped. Then their yellow taxi pulled up, and a man got out, suddenly seeming so tall and handsome to her. He brought two small creatures to her in dresses for the season. They were amazingly beautiful little girls with reddish blonde hair pulled back into large ponytails. As they came closer, she saw that they had their father's sparkling blue eyes, but their mother's features. These are Simone O'Reilly's daughters, and there was no mistaking that. Jimmy walked up to Carrie, smiling, putting his arm around the girl's shoulders. Vicky was the first to notice Carrie giving her a jealous look as her father introduced them. The girls were on their guard, as was the woman. But the meeting was important. Carrie's warm greeting was received with uncertainty. A good political agent knew not to push, but to remain calm and move forward slowly. "Well, I guess it's time for us to go in," Jimmy said, feeling tense but relieved that both parties were giving each other a calm, if reluctant, welcome. Programs and small sweets were purchased. They took their places, placing the girls between them. Vicky sat next to Carrie. There was a preliminary discussion about ballet using the program, and both girls were femininely involved with Carrie, which only tangentially included Jimmy. The tension subsided, and by intermission, the female half of the party accepted each other and went to the toilet together. The second half of the day was a great success. Carrie and the girls enjoyed the Nutcracker in a way that Jimmy was unable to, but his mind was calm and his thoughts clear. As he enjoyed the company of his ladies, he was at peace with himself. Work is put aside. Problems at home didn't seem like problems at all to him. Carrie noticed the smile of the man she was next to. This stirred up feelings in her that were already rising within her. She enjoyed the ballet and was sad when it ended. She enjoyed being with Vicky and Beth, and knew they enjoyed being with her. As they stood up to leave, she found herself sitting next to Jimmy. She placed her hand in his, and a warm feeling came over her as he gently squeezed her hand, and Vicky took her other hand, while little Beth held on to Daddy. Carrie held their hands and had no intention of letting go. The little family walked across the square and headed to where Carrie had parked the Audi. Soon, she will give up Raymond's car and his apartment in Chelsea. He was her past. Her future was uncertain, but now that she had found it, she intended to hold on to it. Jimmy looked at her and smiled. She smiled back. His wife may return, but her place will be taken. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.